So in chapter 3, we're going to start talking about the cell. So again, the cell is the basic unit of life. So it is incredibly important when we start talking about biology. So with cell theory, it really, these discoveries about cells really came out of the improvements in microscopes. So they really started being able to look at really tiny things and then started to find out how much life there is that you can't even see, just because they were able to look smaller and see all of these cells. So this is actually what kind of the first microscopes really looked like. So you can tell, looks kind of fancy, but also looks really, really old. So it's kind of based on the same concept that our light microscopes are today, except they would actually use a candle to get the light. So they don't have the light shining up through the sample like we do today, but they would actually have the light shining on the sample from a candle. Okay, so not necessarily the greatest light source, not necessarily the greatest lenses, magnification, all of that. But through all of these discoveries and using the microscope to look at various cells and samples and everything, several scientists worked together, not necessarily on purpose, but they worked together to create cell theory. So it's a unifying concept of biology. Okay, and these are actually some of the drawings that they did of some of their early observations. So like the top image here is looking at a plant, and you can actually see the very structured cells there. Okay, and we'll get into more of that later, why that's actually a thing. But and then these are some of the animal cells that other scientists started to look at, and you can tell some of the drawings are a little strange, but they basically thought that they were miniature animals. They didn't really conceptualize the idea of cells so much. But again, cells are the basic unit of life, and many scientists contributed to this cell theory. So there are 5 major ones that we're going to talk about right here. The first one, his name is Hooke, Robert Hooke. He was the first to identify and name cells. So he named them after a monk's cell. Okay, so he first looked at cork when he made this discovery, and cork is plant-derived, so it is that very straight line cell. It's rather square-looking or rectangular, and so it really did kind of look like cells, like a monk's cell or cells in a monastery. Okay. Next up, we have a scientist that has a relatively similar name. It's Leeuwenhoek. Okay, Leeuwenhoek. Anyway, he was the first to see cells in greater detail and also the first to look at living cells. So cork is not actually, like the cork sample that Hooke was looking at is not living. So Leeuwenhoek was the first one to actually see a living cell and see that there is like some motion involved. He couldn't necessarily see all of it, okay, because his microscope was not that great, but he did see a lot of detail and really kind of saw a lot more than what Hooke did. Then we get Schleiden. So obviously kind of German name here. So Schleiden was the one who started looking at multiple different species of plants. And so what he discovered was that all plants are made of cells. Okay, it kind of seems like an obvious statement to us now, but at the time they really didn't know anything smaller than what they could see with the naked eye. And you can't really see cells with the naked eye. So this was actually a kind of big thing, and he really looked at a whole bunch of cells, a whole bunch of plants in order to determine this. And then a guy with another somewhat similar sounding name came along and did it with animal cells. So his name is Schwann, and I always remember that he discovered animal cells because his name sounds like swan, which, bird, animal. Okay, so not only did he say that all animals are made of cells, he took it a step further and kind of combined the whole plants are made of cells and animals are made of cells to all living things are made of cells. Okay, so this again was really groundbreaking because nobody had been able to look that close at something that small before. And then finally we have Virchow. Okay, so he came along and he's actually first saw cell division. Okay, now he didn't necessarily see it the way we can with microscopes and everything. He kind of more inferred that it was there. But again, this is a really weird thing for us to think about, or that somebody actually had to come along and make the discovery that cells come from other cells. It's kind of something that we just know now. But back in their day, people actually believed in spontaneous creation. So if you left a piece of meat out for a long time and it started to rot, you would get flies on the meat. Well, at that time, people believed that the meat actually created the flies, that they weren't like laid there or anything. They were actually created by the meat. Okay, so it's a spontaneous creation. And Virchow actually did an experiment to kind of kick off this whole idea of cells come from other cells, where he put one piece of meat out on the counter, okay, and then he put another piece of meat on the counter, but he covered it with a bowl. And then just waited until the flies started to appear. And his idea was, if the flies are actually being created by the meat, there will be flies on both pieces of meat. Okay, but of course, as we know, some flies had to come in, lay the eggs on the meat, and then the flies hatched and, did all that and grew up, and that's where the flies came from. And so he found out that, flies are not created by the meat, spontaneous creation doesn't exist. But again, it's not really something we think about because that's just weird that they thought that flies came from the meat. Okay, so that was his whole that was the whole experiment that kind of kicked off all of this. And so he started looking at, well, where does all of this come from? Where do these cells come from? And so he discovered that cells come from other cells. Okay, so there are 3 principles in the cell theory. So first up, all organisms are made of cells. They can be made of one cell if they're a single-celled organism, or multiple cells. Billions, trillions of cells. Okay, these are skin cells. Okay, so all organisms are made of cells. And then, all existing cells are produced by other living cells. So nowadays, we can actually see under a microscope, we can watch a cell divide. Okay, so we can see this production of living cells by other living cells. Okay, so we have seen what Virchow postulated, what his idea was. And then finally, the cell is the most basic unit of life. Okay, I know this looks like a pepper. That is actually a cell. And this little thing here that comes off the end is actually how it moves. It spins it around in circles, and so it acts like a propeller. So, cells are very varied. Okay. So all cells share certain characteristics. Okay, so cells are microscopic. Okay, basically they're tiny. I'm sure you already knew that. Not that it's groundbreaking. So this is a bacteria cell. It is almost 9,000 magnification to see it at this size. So a lot of magnification there just to see this one little tiny cell. All cells are enclosed by a membrane. Okay, it's actually the blue line here. This cell has a bit of a complex membrane, so this red portion is also part of its membrane. Okay, and then all cells are filled with what's known as cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is a water-based gel kind of thing. It's got a lot of different proteins and nutrients and all different sorts of things dissolved in it. Okay, So it is kind of gel-like, but it's also a very fluid gel. So everything inside the cell can move through the cytoplasm relatively easily. Okay? All right. So those are the three major characteristics that all cells share. You've got microscopic, so they're absolutely tiny. They all have a cell membrane, and they all have cytoplasm. Now, when you talk about cell types, there are two major types that we break this down into. You have eukaryotic and prokaryotic. So eukaryotic are more advanced. Okay, so human, animal cells, plant cells, these are all eukaryotic. They do contain what are called organelles, which just means tiny organs. Okay, so we're going to go into the organelles more in depth in the next couple sections, but organelles are, they carry out different functions. Each organelle has a specific function. Their shape is generally based on that function, so on and so forth. All multicelled organisms and some single-celled organisms are eukaryotic. Okay, so the whole being able to communicate with other cells in an organism is specifically a eukaryotic trait. Okay, you don't see that in prokaryotes. Okay, now there are some single-celled organisms that are eukaryotes. Right, they are just more advanced cells. They have those organelles, they have a nucleus, all that stuff, but they are not multicellular. Okay. Now, when we talk about prokaryotic, these are generally bacteria, archaea, things of those natures. So they are considered less advanced. Okay, they don't have any organelles. So their DNA is not contained in a nucleus. It's out in the cytoplasm. They don't have any mitochondria, anything like that. And they are all single-celled organisms. Now, prokaryotes do actually have kind of a mode that they can go in where they kind of act like a multicellular organism, but they aren't. It's called a plaque, okay, or a biofilm or something like that. Those conditions aren't all that common, okay, but if you do get a biofilm, it's really nasty to try to get rid of because they start working as like a full-on colony where they're protecting each other. They excrete this kind of solution sort of thing that kind of sits on them and like protects them all, and it's really hard to get rid of. So they're nasty, but all right. We're actually going to pause here and continue in the next video with this.